Asus has been a strange but smart brand. With the exception of the ROG line, the Asus Zenfone 9 is the only phone that they released in 2022, and honestly, has probably been the best phone that I used all last year. But going into 2023, is it still worth buying? Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, and today we're going to talk about the almost perfect compact phone that you can buy. Let's get started. The screen is nice, but explains the compactness. While the Samsung S22 goes for a big screen in a small area, the Zenfone 9 goes for a perfect screen in a small area. And what I mean by that is that this makes sense if you want a narrow phone. This is a flat 5.92-inch OLED display with a 1080p resolution with 445 pixels per inch and a screen refresh rate of 120 Hz. This is interesting because you get the option of 60, 90, or 120 Hz, with the final option automatically switching when the phone sees fit. The screen brightness is good at about 450 nits when the auto brightness is turned off, something I do when I test all my phones. With that said, outdoor brightness goes to about 800 nits, with Asus claiming 1100 nits, but brightness was never an issue for me, often being too bright at times and leaving no issues in direct sunlight. The front is covered by Gorilla Glass Victus and is oddly the only glass on the phone besides the camera area. There's a hole punch for the camera, and maybe I'm just used to it by now because it doesn't bother me, though it is fairly large and noticeable with the screen off. But viewing content, it's pretty good. If I had to guess, I would say that it's not the highest end screen, but it's still definitely not the worst, making content maybe 5 to 10% lower quality when compared to something like an iPhone 13 Pro. I think if they went with a 1440p display, it would definitely look a lot sharper and I would probably like it more. With that said, it is something that I noticed, while no one else that I showed this phone to ever complained about it. The physical aspect of the phone is what brings people to this phone. For one, the red in person looks so much better than what Asus displays. But starting with the outside, we have the glass on the front with aluminum in the middle. On the top, we have a headset jack with a microphone, but I know all you care about is a phone with a headset jack and the specs. On the left, there's just antenna bands, while on the right is where the volume and power buttons are, with the latter including the fast and reliable fingerprint scanner. This has Zen Touch built in, which is pointless but noteworthy at the same time. It's a funny name because it's only on the side of the phone, and that's it. Nowhere in the software is it named that. Regardless, this allows you to set up a double press for Google Assistant or the camera, but also has other options like toggling the flashlight or Wi-Fi, or literally opening up eBay to your wish list. It's wild how many options there are and how far it goes in some apps. Same with press and hold, which normally I use for the power button, but it does make sense in this phone because you have quick settings with the power button in it. Yep, you can press and hold to go directly to your YouTube subscriptions. Then we have the swiping of the button for notifications, which is pretty common on Pixel phones and on the Samsung S10e, but this also gives you the options that you see now, which is less than pushing the button, but more than any phone that I've ever seen. Okay, I'm done with the side button side track. Finally, the bottom of the phone is where we get the bottom loudspeaker, the bottom microphone, dual SIM tray for those that need it, and the USB-C 2.0 port that allows for 30 watts of charging. Yes, USB 2.0. I tried with many different cables, it's definitely 2.0. Then on the back, we have the interesting, almost like a soft touch paper backing, though it is a polycarbonate because the phone is IP68 dust and water resistant, something that Asus lets you know on the specs page and actually explains that it will degrade over time. They don't just hide it in the footnotes like Apple, Google, and Samsung do. Wait, Samsung doesn't even let you know that it deteriorates over time, and I thought that Apple hated their customers. Of course, you see the labeling and the cameras, but I'll talk about those a little bit later. Moving into the phone, we get a few things with a missing one. What makes this phone run is the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 chip, which is a really dumb name, but the best Qualcomm chip at launch, and still one of the best chips until a couple days ago, which gets paired with 8 or 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM and 128 or 256 gigabytes of UFS 3.1 storage. That USB 2.0 doesn't really make sense now. The strange thing is that all colors come in the 828GB model, while the 256GB model only comes in black and white, while 16GB RAM only comes with 256GB and only in black. Of course, mine has to be the 8/128GB version because I chose the red one. But back to the chip, this is clearly the winner of the phone. This will allow you to use this phone for years, which is especially good if other companies follow Apple and start getting rid of their compact flagship phones. This chip flies through tasks and never leaves you waiting, all while giving you the option to almost perform like a compact ROG phone. This phone gets hot while gaming, but I never really had an issue with normal apps, even when scrolling through apps for a while. To power this phone, we get the 4300 mAh cell that not only lasts a long time, but recharges at up to 30 watts. With light usage, 3 days is possible, and even with heavy usage, I'm looking at over 5 hours of screen on time. All-day battery life is easy, and medium usage will give you about 2 days easily. Then we have little things like Wi-Fi 6E and 5G support, NFC and Bluetooth 5.2, but we lack wireless charging in this phone. Not sure how much they saved on development and certification, but it still feels weird not having that option on a flagship phone. Overall, Asus packed so much into this tiny but somewhat thick phone, and it makes up for the things that they did leave out. Honestly, I wasn't expecting the battery life to be this good. Now here's what you're probably most curious about other than the battery. Starting with the front camera, we get a 12 megapixel Sony sensor, which is surprisingly focusable, though the focus distance did make me believe that it wasn't. Shots are actually not that bad, and video goes to 4K 30 frames per second with a very large crop if you decide to leave stabilization on. Flipping to the back cameras, we get these two huge rear sensors, one being a 12 megapixel ultrawide sensor that focuses and allows for macro shots, while the main sensor is a 50 megapixel one with major optical image stabilization being the 6-axis hybrid gimbal stabilizer. The ultrawide is pretty good and is a nice complement to the main sensor, giving it almost identical color and quality to the main, with the exception of low light photos. Overall, the sensor looks and performs pretty well, but side note, you can record 4K 60, though you can't switch between the main sensor and the ultrawide sensor while you're recording. Something that only a few phones do, and something that you can also do at 4K 30. Speaking of, the other sensor is a 50 megapixel one, which looks pretty good if you choose the binned 4x3 12.5 megapixel option, because the full 50 megapixel shots can get too detailed and become more sensitive when shooting, so the slightest move can ruin a shot on the edges. As for normal shots, they look pretty good, almost reminding me of the color science on most Google Pixel phones. It would also explain how the app kind of reminds me of the Pixel as well. I personally love the shots, but I'm not too excited about zooming into a shot or low light photos. There is a 2x button, and I honestly can't tell if it crops into the sensor like the iPhone 14 and the Pixel 7 does, but if it doesn't, it seems like a really easy addition. As for video, the stabilization is supposed to be out of this world, but normal stabilization in 4K 60 feels pretty much the same as a gimbal stabilization at 1080p 60, which is what the mode is capped in. Regardless, we do get 8K, but it's only at 24 frames per second, but hey, at least it's stabilized. The gimbal stabilization is supposed to be a big deal, but since it can't do 4K, I'm not ever going to use it. There are some other options in the camera, like 4K 120 frames per second for slow motion, and this option called Light Trail, but really the main focus is the main sensor. I think I have some extra photos, so I'll show you what those look like, and then I'm going to close out this category. Enjoy! For me, the camera is solid, but lacking all the gimmicks that I like, and the only gimmick that is here I don't actually have a use case for. But either way, I would expect OnePlus style shots with a hint of Pixel, rather than the opposite. Honestly, this feels like the best compact phone to buy on the Android side. This isn't the lightest, but it also isn't the heaviest at 169 grams, similar to how the size isn't exactly the smallest, being slightly bigger than the Samsung S22 in every way except for the width. Now we do lack some things like Android 13, which is what I was supposed to say, but Asus decided to launch Android 13 right before I made this video. It did only add a few different things, but it is funny how companies decide to change or add something right before someone makes a YouTube video. There is so much software in the phone that it not only looks better than what Samsung would offer on the S22, but it just makes so much sense. Similar to Pixel phones, we get the large Android Material U toggles, which you can turn on or off, but unlike the stupid Pixel Internet one, the Wi-Fi one actually works with a single tap. Crazy, right? There's just a lot of things in here that makes this feel like a better OnePlus device. We We get the always on display, which doesn't entirely follow the Google Pixel style, but we also get double tap to wake and sleep. Like I said, the fingerprint scanner is super fast, but the face unlock isn't entirely slow either. The speakers do sound good, but you can tell that the top one isn't as loud as the bottom one, though it's supposed to be a stereo setup. At high volumes, the phone does vibrate a little and is loud, but not as loud as the iPhone 14 Pro speakers. Still very usable and good overall for voices and music playback. I don't really know how to explain it, but I loved using this phone. I actually feel bad thinking that I can't daily drive this phone because of how I do my reviews on here, but at the same time, this phone is technically too small for me. I like having a small and large phone, which is why I have the iPhone 14 Pro with whatever phone that I review, which is generally a large phone. But it's nice to know that you can pretty much have an iPhone 14 for Android, just trade the wireless charging for a headset jack. At the end of the day, there are endless amounts of Android phones that are large, with only a couple compact options. The Samsung S22 is barely smaller and thinner than this phone, but there are a few trade-offs that just make the Asus Zenfone 9 a better phone and experience overall. With that said, this price is why I question buying this phone in the first place. Finding a used one is difficult, I just bought this one new, but you can find these in the $500 range, while the Samsung S22 is under $400, and the processor is not really that much different. With that said, I personally think that the Zenfone 9 looks better than the S22. I do wish that we got wireless charging, but I barely ever use that in the first place. They also had these interesting add-ons for the phone, but it feels like the essential phone attachments because the pricing is outrageous for what I can see. Who's going to be paying over $100 for a kickstand and a wallet, or $200 for this outrageous backpack mount? The battery life and processor are my favorite things about this phone, making daily usage a breeze. Sure, it isn't as small as the iPhone 12 mini, but it has been many years since we've seen Android phones reasonably get to that size, and those weren't even flagship devices. I'm hoping that other companies follow the idea that compact phones should exist, and I can't wait to see what Asus does in 2023. It's pretty funny to me because they make these massive ROG phones and then this compact phone. If you need the fastest chip in the smallest size, I see this being the only phone for a while. Also, if you don't like Apple or Samsung, this is pretty much your only option. And that's my review of the Asus Zenfone 9, the only compact flagship worth the money. But what do you think? Are compact phones important? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.